Welcome to this free 1-hour course, Getting Started with Figma. These videos are outtakes of the extensive Getting Started with Figma course on moonlearning.io. This course is for total beginners and we're starting from scratch, understanding Figma's general file structure and creating our first design files. Then we'll dive into the fundamentals, such as setting up frames and nesting them, adding shapes, text, colors, and grids, creating a solid UI design. I'll show you how to turn your design elements into reusable components, and in under 1 hour, you'll be ready to set up your designs in Figma. To work alongside me, make sure that you download the free Figma exercise file that comes with this course. You'll find a link to the file in the description below. The file and the course are divided up into bite-sized chapters. You can also find timestamps in the description below and jump to the chapters you're after. But for now, let's start from scratch. The Figma file browser, or in other words, Figma's home. When you open Figma, you're going to see something like this, or probably something like this, just with a lot of files in the center. This is the place where you keep your files and your teams organized. Before we create our first file, let's make sure that we understand the Figma file structure, which is a little weird in the beginning, but just bear with me. First, we have teams. They can be for your own work or for collaboration. Within teams, we then have projects, which you can use to group files into different projects within a team. On the free plan, you currently get one free project. Inside a project, you can now have multiple files, either FigJam files or design files. These files are where you would do the actual work. You can further structure them into pages. Let's get back to the real thing. Over here, we can see our teams. You might have already been invited to a team, then you'll see it here on the left. You can also create your own teams. Simply click on the plus button, name your team. Then you can choose if you want to invite others. We can skip this for now. You can always invite later. Choose a team plan. You can always go for starter and then later upgrade if you need any additional features. You'll then see the team you created on the top. You can always right-click to delete a team. Let's use my existing team, Moon Pro, to investigate a little further. If I click on it, I can see the projects. Now, the name projects is very confusing because it seems like this is how you have to set this up. Note that this comes from the very early days of Figma. These days, we use project just as any subfolder and a level of organization, so you can name and use them for anything. If I click onto my projects, then I can see my files inside of that project. You can open any file by simply clicking. This will create an own tab for this file. On the left-hand side, inside of the file, you'll see the pages. To jump back, simply click on the house icon. A very handy feature is that if you hover over any file, you get this little star here, and you can mark your file as favorites. This will store the file in your favorite section on the left-hand side menu. This is super handy when you have a lot of files. This way you can mark the ones you're currently working on. If you click on the team, then you can also invite others to this team, either by sending a link or inviting via email. You can change from view rights to edit rights. Just make sure that you check the costs when inviting other editors. If you want to change rights, then you can always click on the little edit symbol here, and you'll see everybody that's part of your team, and via the design role, you can assign view, editor, or any other rights that come with your Figma plan. Another great thing to access via the file browser is the community section. Currently, you find it next to the home icon. Click on this little globe and you're going to access the community. Here you can search for files, plugins, and all sorts of fantastic resources. Figma is always updating and improving the file browser, so by the time you're looking at this, some things might have slightly moved. Let's create a new design file in Figma. You might have noticed that in Figma we have FigJam files and design files. We're going to work with design files. They are for creating UI designs. FigJam files are more for brainstorming, collaborative work and ideation. So I'm going to jump into drafts for now, and I'm going to click on design file. As you can see, there's open a new file in a tab right next to the tab that I already have open, so you can have multiple files opened in Figma. I can rename this file simply by double-clicking the name and then give it any name I want. If I click on the little arrow next to the name, then I could already move it into any project I want from here. But I'm going to jump back to home by clicking on the house icon, and I can see my file that I created in drafts. Now I can simply drag it to any project and team I want. If I go into the project, I can see my file here. If I wanted to rename it, I can also do that simply by right-clicking and choose Rename. Usually, files in Figma are always shared within the file browser. However, if you ever get a download file, so a file that ends with .fig, then in order to see it inside of your file browser, make sure that you use the import button. It's not going to work by simply double-clicking it. Let's start with the base of everything in Figma, frames. Make sure you're in a design file. This grey area you see here in the center is called a canvas. Think of it like the surface of a table you're working on. On top of it, you'll add your designs like sheets of paper. In Figma, those sheets are called frames. You can add images, text, and shapes to those frames to set up your designs. To create a frame, you can go to the top toolbar and then simply select the frame tool from the menu, or you can also simply hit F on your keyboard. We now open the Figma preset frame menu on the right-hand side. And as you can see, Figma set up most common screen sizes for you. If I click on one of them, then it's going to add the frame in that size to my canvas. In case you're not after a specific screen size, you can also draw a frame. So let's hit F again, and then we can simply drag a frame open on our canvas. Now the great thing is, if I select this frame and jump back to the frame dropdown, I could also turn this into any of those presets. You can use the shortcut Shift and 2 to center anything on your canvas. Two things happened. Figma added those frames to our canvas, and we can also see the frames in our left-hand side Layers panel. The Layers panel is basically a mirror of everything that happens on the canvas. You can rename your frames. You can either click directly on the name of the frame and then simply type what you're after, or you can also click on the name in the Layers panel. We always use frames and never shapes to represent our screens in Figma. Unlike traditional artboards, you can nest frames within frames in Figma, which will allow you to create more complex layouts later on. A few handy shortcuts. You can toggle the menu on and off by pressing Command or on Windows Control and full stop. On some keyboards, you can also use the caret key. You can move around the canvas by pressing your spacebar and then simply drag. You can zoom in and out by pressing Command and plus and Command and minus. To have your design displayed at 100%, click Command and 0. If you want to use Zoom and Fit, that means to see all elements on your canvas, simply hit Shift and 1. And if you want to zoom in one particular element, select it and hit Shift and 2. Let's get a quick overview of our design file before we dive deeper. So you can see here we have our frames and then we have different panels and we're going to get to know all of them. We have layers, assets, design and prototyping. Let's stay in layers for now. In the layers panel, you could also add additional pages to your file. If you click on the little arrow next to page 1, you get a drop down and you can click on plus to add pages. This is basically a new canvas. Pages can serve different purposes and we're going to talk more about them later on. Also notice how I set up this file in a free account. This means you're limited to 3 pages. On Pro accounts or above, you can add as many pages as you wish. If you right-click on a page, then you can delete it. If you double-click on the page, you can rename it. On the top here, you find the top toolbar. This is where we find all the main tools, such as drawing frames, shapes, text, and so on. Also note this little Figma sign here on the left. If you click on that, you're going to get a sub-menu. And the most useful one out of this is the quick action. Click on the quick action and now you can search pretty much anything you're after. I recommend that you have a look at shortcuts. If you open shortcuts, this is going to show you all the main shortcuts right down here at the bottom. Everything that's marked blue is a shortcut you already used. Everything white is something you can still try out. Quick search is really handy and should become your best friend. On the right, we can see who's currently in our file. We have the share button. We have dev mode, which we can toggle on and off, and we're going to learn more about all of this. And of course, our prototyping, present and preview. In the future, you might see some features like dev mode being moved to a paid plan. Always have a look at the Figma pricing page where you can see all features and the overview for each plan. On the right-hand side, we find the properties panel. If you click on the grey canvas area, then you get an overview of what's currently going on in your file. Later on, you're going to see your variables, styles, and all sorts of information about your file here. If you click on a certain element, for example, this frame, then you're going to get the properties associated with this frame or later on any element in our design. Let's add some content to our frames. So here I have a frame, which I called frame. Now let's add some shapes. I'm going to go on the shape tool and I can choose between rectangle, lines, arrow, ellipse and polygon, as well as star. Now notice how behind each of those shapes you're going to see the shortcut. I'm going to go for a rectangle. And if I would simply draw it, then it wouldn't keep the shape. So if I want a perfect square, then what I can do is I hold down Shift and I then draw. I can select it and I can then position it. And notice how Figma is going to give you helping lines. Now let's draw a circle. So if I have a look at my menu, I see that the shortcut is O. So let's press O. And again, I hold down Shift so I get a perfect circle. And I'm going to add a circle. Let's add another shape. I'm going to go for a polygon. This one I'm simply going to draw like this. Now notice that there is a little more space. In the right hand side, you can see that now it has a count of 3. You could move this one up and then you could create other polygons. I'm going to leave it at a triangle for now. Let's add some color to this. I'm going to start with my circle here. Make sure that you have the shape that you're after selected, and then on the right hand side, in the properties panel, you can change the color via fill. You can either click on the color swatch and then simply pick any color, or you can also add a hex code, which is what I'm going to do. Now I'm going to select my triangle, and this time I'm going to use the color wheel, and I'm simply going to go for a nice orangey red. And for this square here, I want to use a blue. Play with the fill menu to familiarize. You can use the opacity, so you can simply add any number. You could make the fill visible and invisible, and you could even add more fills. This is, however, something I rarely use. If you click on the swatch, you can see that here you can also change the gradient, and we can change this into an image fill, which is something that we're going to use later on. We could also add a stroke. Now I could add this to this single element, or I can simply select all elements. Simply keep your mouse key down and select everything. And I can now click on the plus button next to stroke, and you'll see that now they each got an outline. I could change the stroke to a thicker stroke, something like 4. And if you, for example, wanted a dotted line, then you could do this here by clicking on the 3 dots and change from solid to dashed. Just as you did with the fill, you could change the color of the stroke. Let's learn about the size menu. I just drew these shapes randomly, but if you want a precise number, then you can select any element, and in the right-hand side properties panel, you can see the width and the height property. Note this little clip here on the side. This means that the width and the height are locked, so if I increase the height, then the width is automatically going to scale with it. You can also unlock them, and you could now manipulate width or height independently. You could also use these boxes for calculations. So for example, I could say 200 minus, let's say 50, and then the result would be my width and height. So let's do the same for our square. I'm also going to set this one to 150, so it has the same width and height than my circle. I also want the width of my triangle to be 150. Now, this has this extra shape around it, and remember, this is because this is actually a polygon, so I can change this here. It's quite handy because it also helps us to position a triangle in the center of something, but sometimes you just want the shape. In this case, you can right-click and you can simply flatten the shape. So let's just clean that up. I'm going to set it also to 150, and I'm going to have this one here at, let's say, 120. I can further manipulate shapes. So what I could do is, for example, I could change the corner radius. So I could add any number here, or I could simply use my up and down keys. And if you hold Shift pressed, then you're going to jump in larger so-called nudge amounts. If you only want one specific corner, then make sure that you open the independent corner menu, and now you can simply choose the corner you're after. We can also rotate our shape, so the same thing. You can go up and down. I'm using my nudge amounts here to rotate any shape. You can also do all of this right on the shape. If you select the shape, then you're going to see these little circles here. This is the corner radius, and you can simply drag that. It will always correspond to the same number in your properties panel. We can also rotate simply by getting close to an edge of any object. Hold down your mouse key and you can now rotate it on the canvas. Again, this is going to reflect the number in the properties panel, and you can change it here as well. A little hidden treasure: if you select a circle, then you're going to see this little circle here. This is the arc tool, and most people actually don't know about this. Hold your mouse key pressed and you can now change the circle, not only in the cutting out, so sweeping it around here, but you can also change the ratio. Nothing that you will use all the time, but quite handy if you want to add some dashboards or charts. Let's learn how to align, tidy up, and measure between your objects. You want to have your shapes tidied up a little bit, so let's select all of them. And by the way, this works for all sorts of elements. And you'll see at the top of your size menu, the alignment menu. So you can align to the left. You could also align them to the right. And what we are after is align them to the center. And this obviously works for horizontal or vertical. You can also align to the top or to the bottom. Another feature I really like is if you click on more options, then you get the tidy up feature. So if you hover over this, you're going to see these little handles, and you're also going to see these circles. So it tidied this up and it created the same distance between all of your elements. Now notice I am using my rectangle, that it's still a polygon and sits inside of its shape. So what I could do is now I could select all of them and I could change those handles, and that will be the same for all of them. And I could also use the properties panel to manipulate this, as it's now going to give me the space between those elements as an own property. You can also select any of those shapes and then swap it out quite easily as soon as it's tidied up. Now, if we select all of them, then they're not aligned in the center yet. You can, however, select all of these together, move them, and then Figma is also going to show you some guiding lines to get the center of your frame. Another handy tool that I use all the time is that if you select a shape and keep Alt pressed and hover over any other shape, then it's going to show you the distance. So this works to the edge of the parent frame or any neighboring objects. Really, really handy. You can still move it while you have Alt selected, and then you will see how the distance changes to this object. Let's add some text. From the top toolbar, select the text menu, or you can simply press T. There are two ways you can add text. You can either simply click anywhere you want to add the text, and then you can start typing. You could also draw a text box. So let's hit T again, and I'm going to draw a text box, and I can now add the text here. It doesn't matter which approach you're going to use, because you can always change it via the text menu, which is what we're going to get to know now. So I'm going to keep both of them. This is going to be my headline, and I'm going to keep this one and just copy in some more dummy text, and we can use it as a copy. I can open a text box larger simply by holding down my mouse key and dragging it. So first of all, I want both of them to have the same typeface. So I select both, and via the menu, I'm going to select a typeface. You can see that all Google fonts are pre-installed if you're using the Figma app. Also, any fonts that you have locally on your computer are going to show up here. I'm going to go for a Google font called Poppins. Now, before I go to change the size and the width, you can see that this is a little bit all over the place. So let's tidy this up. I'm first going to go for what's going to be my headline, and I'm going to set this to auto width. So that means that the text box is always going to adjust to anything that I add in here in width. My copy text, I'm going to set to fixed width and auto height. So that means that it's going to take the full height in, and whatever I add, it's going to adjust to this height. The last one here is fixed height and fixed width, and to be honest, I hardly ever use this. Let's select our shapes, pull them down and make some more space. So now I want to change the weight. I can do this with the second drop down, and I'm going to have my headline in bold, and I'm going to leave my copy text in regular. So obviously I want my headline to be larger, so I can do this with the text size here. You can either type any number, or you can also use your arrow keys on the keyboard to go up and down. Again, if you have Shift pressed, then you're going to jump in your nudge amount. So I'm going to have a big hello on the top here. Now my copy text, I'm going to have this box even larger. I'm going to keep at 16, which is sort of the standard size for copy text. The next one here is the line height. This is a really important one. The line height is, we can see this better at our headline, this little space at the top and the bottom of your text. So this is like a natural gap that we're creating. Always leave that at least at auto, which corresponds to 1.5. Or you could even go higher and set it to 1.7. You can calculate this. So you could say 16 is my text size. And now I am multiplying this by 1.75. And therefore it would give me the pixel value of 28. You could also use a percentage notation. So I have 175%. If this is all new to you, then just leave it at auto for now, which is giving you a really good line height. Whatever you do, don't set it to the same size as your text or even smaller, because what would happen is that you would lose the line height, which might be okay on a one-line headline, but in your copy text, or as soon as something is like changed, like the text box changes as the browser window changes, then text is going to be squished together, and we don't want that. In this next one here, you can change the distance between the letters. And in this one here, you change the paragraph distance. Let me just make some more space here. And I'm going to show you. So if we had a paragraph here, then if we would select this, it would create a distance between this break. The alignment is left, center or right, so pretty standard. And this little tool here means that if you add more text, which direction it's going to grow to. So the default we have it on means that if I copy more text, let's just add more text in here, it will just be added to the bottom. Now, if you had this set to center, then what would happen is that this would grow from the center. And obviously the same, if you had it set to the bottom, it would grow upwards. The three little dots, here you have some extra things such as bullet points, underlining, things like text decoration, and so on. Just as any other object, you can select text and you can align it. And any change in color, you would use the fill menu. And by the way, in Figma and UI design in general, text always has its own box. So a headline has an own box and the copy text has its own box. You could technically have this headline inside the same box, but it's not how we set up UI design. Figma is really all about nesting frames. In the beginning, it might not seem so obvious why everything should be placed on a frame. This is something that you're going to understand much better once you move into more advanced features, like working with components or also layout. Let's have a look what nested frames would look like. So here you have a parent frame, and inside this parent frame, you have more frames. So you have an orange frame, a red frame, and a blue frame. You can see that in the left-hand side layers panel, you can move the frames around simply by dragging them. Now inside those frames, I still have more. So if I click on my blue frame or open it via the layers panel, you can see that I have a shape, but I also have another frame that holds some text. So this would be something like a button that would again be a nested frame. If you select any frame and move it, then everything you placed inside will move with it. If you drag elements between frames, so for example, let's say this shape, I drag it into the red frame, then you can see that it automatically reorganizes in the layers panel, so you don't need to worry about this. I can also simply drag an element out of the parent frame, and it will automatically create another frame on my canvas next to it. You can also draw frames, so if I hit F, I can simply draw a frame inside of here, and if I draw it over certain elements, then it's gonna hold these elements. But let's go back a second to our original setup. If you have all your layers open and want to collapse them, then simply select the parent frame and hit Option or Alt and L. If you want to jump down to the next child element, then hit Enter. Notice how that's going to select all the frames on the next level. If I hit Enter again, it's going to go one step further and so on. If you hit the hash key, then you're going to select the parent again. And don't forget, with Alt and L, you're going to collapse all the layers. If you want to deep select a layer, so let's say you want this button here, then you would have to first click all your way through. What you could do is simply hold Command pressed and then select the layer you're after. This is actually the shortcut you would really need to remember because it's something you're going to use all the time. It's good practice if you already start thinking and designing the basic elements of your design with frames, and I'm going to show you how this works. However, don't get stressed if here or there you make a little mistake or you're unsure what to use. You can always fix that later. So the next question you'll probably have is, why frames and not just groups in Figma? Because in Figma we could simply group elements by selecting them and hitting Command and G. So let's have a closer look at this. Here I have a frame, and this frame holds another blue frame and an ellipse. And here I have the same setup, but this is a group, as you can see in the Layers panel. Now I can move them as a group, so this is what I'm after, and I could even place them into another frame. So let's say drawing a frame around them, and then you can see both of them sit nicely inside of this frame, whether it's my nested frame or whether it's my nested group. So in the beginning, it seems like there isn't much of a difference, so why not just go for this one? And it's true, when I start designing, sometimes I actually use groups. They're somehow faster and easier to manage at the beginning. So if I do a quick draft of something, I often start with groups. You actually don't need to worry because even if you have a group, you could always convert this into a frame later simply by using the drop-down menu on the right-hand side, and you could always convert any frame back into a group if for whatever reason you wanted to. So in the beginning, don't stress yourself too much about how you need to set all of this up. It's going to come to you once you move on to the more advanced things like auto layout and design with components, as well as prototyping, where you're going to notice that you're simply going to need a frame, or Figma is even going to give you a hand and convert everything into frames for you when needed. Let's still try to get in a habit of working with frames. So for now, just a few basic differences that you might notice right away. The first one is if I have a frame, then you can see on the right-hand side, I get this little box I can tick, which is called Clip Content. Now, Clip Content is really handy, especially because we're using the frame to represent our viewport or our device size. And therefore, we're going to have content that overflows. So this is something that later with prototyping we might want to animate, but in the beginning we don't want to see all of this overflow. So it's really handy that we can show and hide this. I can't do that on a group. You're also going to notice that if you want to use this as your background, let's say we're just resizing this one here, then we have exactly the same look. So if we're using this, then we're missing some features. Have a look if I switch over to the frame. So you'll see I'm getting much more features like layout grids and all of these different selections. So here I'm getting quite a few. I could, for example, add auto layout, something we're going to do later on. And if I take it off, you'll notice that Figma was nice enough to convert this into a frame for me. So rather than stressing about the right approach, I recommend just jump in, get some practice, and once you reach the more advanced features, it's going to all fall into place. Let's set up a first design with nested frames in Figma. Here's a classic example. I have a parent frame, and this is called blog, which holds other frames and elements. So you can see here I have my navigation, which is also a frame that holds another frame, and inside I have some lines representing the burger menu. By the way, I can just drag this up here if I want to change the order. Next up, I have my headline, and you can see that headlines or just text as such is not placed on a separate frame unless it's like part of a card or another element. So a headline you can just place freely on your parent frame. Then I have my card here. You can see I have 2 cards. Again, if I wanted to change the order, simply drag that within your layers panel. Inside of my card, you can see I have a shape, which I called image, and then I have a headline and I have some text. So let's recreate this, and in the process of building, it will become much clearer why and how I set up the different elements. Okay, so let's move this a little bit and let's hit F and let's add an empty screen right next to it with the same size. And with Shift and 2, we center them right in the middle. I'm going to go through this quite fast, so feel free to just pause the video and try out different steps in your own time. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to press L and it activates the line tool. You can see that up here, the shortcuts. And I'm going to draw a line for my burger menu. Let's set this to 40. And what I'm going to do now is going to select this, hit Shift and Option or Alt, and then I'm going to drag down a copy. And you can see that I can now see the direct size. If you don't have that, you can also select it and just use the tidy up tool. Now let's select all of them, and I'm going to make them a bit bigger so we can see them better, so 2 pixels. Now the next thing you might do is go and change that into a group. So Command and G would create a group. And on the left hand side here, you can see a group, and you can call this burger. And to be honest, for right now, that would work just fine. If you later want to change this into a frame, then you can simply select your group, and in your right hand side properties panel, you can simply switch between frames and groups. Note how the group, if I wanted some extra space, is not allowing me to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this into a frame for now. And you can see it would show me everything if I clip, but it's going to cut off some stuff. But what you can then do is simply press Command, and you can now resize this frame to your liking. Now let's finish off our navigation. Simply press F. And instead of picking a frame, I'm going to draw a frame, and I'm going to draw it around the burger that I just made. And you can see if I draw it around any element, then this element is going to automatically sit inside the frame. So it's going to move with this frame. Let's give the background some tint so we can see it better. I'm just using my fill and just picking a slightly darker color. Let's make sure we have a fill here as well. In case you don't have a fill, just press on plus and it's going to give you white as a default. You can still select your burger inside here. If you press Command, you can even deep select, so our strokes. But the easiest way is actually to hit Enter, and that selects all child elements. And you can then use the alignment tool to center it in the middle of your navigation that you just created. So next one up is some text. So let's press T, and I can simply draw a text box wherever I want to add this. So I can add text in here, and I'm simply going to copy the text I already wrote, and I'm going to place it inside of here. Now you can see that that automatically took the styling of that text. If you wanted to change that, you could do this over here. Get in the habit of always adding auto height to your text. This will simply mean that if I am deleting some text or if I am adding some text, that the text box would automatically respond. Let's add the frame for our card. I simply hit F, and instead of using the preset menu, I'm going to draw this card onto my canvas. I'm going to add a bit of an effect, so that's going to give a shadow to the background. And notice if you don't see anything, then make sure that your frame has a fill. If it doesn't, simply click on plus and it's going to give it a white default fill. If you want to change the effect, then you can do that by simply clicking on the sun icon. I'm going to add this area for the image to my frame. So I'm going to hit R and I'm going to draw a rectangle. If I draw it onto my frame, you can see that in the frame menu, it's automatically added to the frame. If I double click, I can change this to image. There's a lot of opinion about whether a placeholder for an image should be a frame or should be a shape. Don't worry too much about it. There is no right or wrong. Both approaches will work. You'll generally see me using shapes a little more than frames in most cases because I feel it's easier to add images to them. But in some occasions, a frame will make sense. Sometimes I even use a frame with a shape inside if I'm working with advanced animation and zoom effects. So at this point, don't worry too much about it. Just use what works best for you. Now let's add our headline. So I press T, so I get my text tool and I write headline. And for my copy text here, I'm just going to be lazy and copy that over from my example. Now notice how this is already set at auto height, and I'm going to leave it at this. You can adjust it however you want to set up this card. And I'm also going to have this headline at auto height. In general, auto width I would use for something like buttons where I know it's not going to flow into a second line. That looks great. Let's just tidy up the naming. And I'm going to rearrange them a little bit. Okay, fantastic. Now, one thing I want to point out is notice how here we have clip content. So clip content, let's just draw another shape in here. If I had, let's say, a circle, you can see that it's not going to display the full circle. If you select the parent frame, then you can see everything outside of your card. So sometimes if you don't see elements, or especially if you're working with an outline of something, then make sure that your clip content is set. To make a copy of your card, simply select the card, press Alt or Option, and little tip, hold Shift pressed as well, then it will copy it just in the line below and it won't move left and right. Here you go, your first layout is done. Let's create some reusable grids. Here I have my blog page and I have another detailed page if I click on this article. Now I want to add the same grid to both of them to make sure that they follow the same overall layout. To add a grid, simply select a frame, and note this works on any frame. So in this case, I'm going to select my parent frame here, representing the viewport. And on the right hand side, I'm going to click on Layout Grid. Per default, you're going to get this pixel grid, but we don't want that. We want columns. So click on the icon and then from the drop down, choose columns. You can change the count. So I could change this to 4 and I can also set a margin. So let's try something like 24. Note how I always work with multiples of 4 or 8. And then for the gutter, I'm going to go also for a multiple of 8, so 24. Actually, let's move this up a little bit to 32. Now, there are different kinds of grids. So stretch is probably the most common one. That means that if I change the width, then it's going to stretch. So the column stretch and the gutter and the margin stays the same. Remember, you can always go back to the original size via the menu. Now, if I go for center, then that will mean that the grid stays in the center. And I would need to figure out what width I would need in here. So you need to do a little bit of math to find out what you're after. But for now, let's stick to stretch and let's jump back to our original size of an iPhone 14. I could now apply the same grid to my other frame simply by going through that process again, but it's much easier and better practice to save it as a style. So I'm going to select the frame where my grid is on, and then where I see the grid that I just created, click on the styles icon. You can now click on the plus and you can save it. So I'm going to call it mobile grid. You can add some more description here and then create the style. If you click on the gray canvas, then you're going to see this grid style saved in your overview. If you right click, then you could also alter it or delete it. Now, if we want to apply it to any other frame, simply select that frame and then from the grid menu, if you hover over it, you're going to see the styles icon. You can now select that grid. I can now start to align, for example, my text boxes to the grid. Notice that with things like these cards here, this is later going to be auto layout. So all of this is gonna work a little more automated, but for now, let's do it by hand. So I can move this little back button in here, aligning with the grid. And with my image, I could choose whether I want this image here to go to the edge or whether I want this to sit in the grid. If you position images on the grid, always make sure that you use the file columns. Don't do anything like positioning it in the middle of a column or something like this. So for now, I'm actually going to use the full width. And then I'm going to do the same with my text boxes. Let's just make sure that they sit nicely in the grid. You can hide or show the grid either by using the right-hand side menu. If you hover over it, you see this little eye icon, or you can use the shortcut Control and G. The Figma community and plugins. In your account, so this can be in the Figma app or in the browser, you can find the Figma community. Note that this moves quite around a bit lately. So right now it's down here on the left. And also if you click on your name, you can click on your community profile. So in the community, you could also share your own resources. But in the beginning, you probably want to check out others' resources. So click on the community button up here again, and then you can simply type whatever you're looking. So if you're looking for, let's say, icons, then you would get an overview of community files that you can use with some icons in there. If you click on that, let's just take the first one, then just click on Open in Figma, and it's going to open in your Figma account and you can store it there. By the way, you can also search for names. So search for Moon Learning or my name, Christine Valor, and you can follow me as well. And you can see all the free community files that I added here. You can simply click on them and then you can get a copy to work with in your account. In the community, you can also find plugins. So let's say you want a plugin around color. Then you can have a look, simply search color, and then on the left-hand side, make sure that you pick the plugins tab. You can now browse whatever you're after. Now in here, you can check out those plugins and you get a description and you also get a rating. You can see how many people already downloaded it, but you can't use it right in here. You could click on try it out, but it's actually much better if you access the plugin right from your Figma file. So in my design file, at the top, you can find resources in your toolbar. Click on that and then make sure that you don't stay in the first step, but click on the second one here called plugins. And now you can simply search the plugin you're after. So I want to use this plugin here called HTML to Design. If you found the plugin, then click on it and it's gonna run. All plugins operate a bit in their own way, and they're going to give you the information on how in this little box here. HTML to Design is one of my favorite ones. Simply add a real-life URL. You can also choose the size that you want it to be displayed. Click Import, and it's going to generate the real website as a Figma version for you. You can then jump in, select elements, for example here, our text. You can alter it, you can play with it, and it's also going to have created things like these cards here for you, so you can drag them out and you could alter or redesign them. Adding images to your designs. There are different ways to add images to your designs. You could use the Fill menu. You could copy existing images. You could bulk import images, or you could use a plugin. Let's run through all of these options bit by bit. So the first option is to simply add an image via the Fill menu. So select your frame or shape and then jump into Fill and then switch over to Image. You can now get the option to choose an image and you can simply select that image from your file. However, this is a little slow, so we could also bulk select those images. Hit Shift Command or on Windows Control and K, and you can now select multiple images at once. You'll see on your cursor a preview of the next image to place and the number of how many images you have stored. You could add it directly on the canvas, or you can click into any shape to place the image. You might also have the situation that you already have images in your design file that you want to reuse. Now you don't need to export and import them, you can use them right from here. Simply select the image, hit Shift, Command and C, and this is going to copy a PNG. And you can simply paste this by pressing Command or Control and V to place it into any other shape. Our last option, and actually my favorite one, is to use a plugin. Go to Resources and search for the Unsplash plugin. Run the plugin, and now you can search any image of your liking. I'm going to use one of the preset categories, portraits. Now all of these images are high resolution and royalty free, so you can really use them for your designs. Simply select any shape, then select the image that you're after, and it will fill the shape with your image. So for our design, we could just run the Unsplash plugin and then just select the place where we planned for the image. And then for now, let's just go for a nature image. We could select this. This would fill here. And now let's say we close the Unsplash plugin, but we want to use this over here as well. Then we could use our shortcut, Shift, Command and C. That would copy a PNG, select and just place it in here. If you want to change the selection of the image, then double click and you're going to get the image menu. And here in the drop down, which is set to fill, choose crop. You can now move the image around, and you can also, if you get close to the edges, you can also change the size. If you hold Shift, then it's going to scale proportionally. You can also use Figma for illustration and drawing. Figma is a vector-based program, so if you worked with something like Illustrator before, this will be very familiar to you. It's important to note that Figma is primarily made for UI design setup, so it's not really about illustration, but you can get some pretty nice results if you want to set up things like icons, for example. So you could use simply your shapes here for illustrating. So if I draw a shape and if I double click on that shape, then notice how I'm getting a different menu, and you can click on it and therefore you're going to get these new tools. So you're going to get these curves and things like that. Now you probably want to set up your own illustration, and therefore it would make more sense to go for your pencil or your pen tool. If you're experienced with illustration and have things like a trackpad and pens at home, then you might want to go for the pencil. So here you can draw freely. However, if you're working with a mouse in a more standard setup, then you probably want to go for the pen tool. The pen tool is something you're going to be really used to if you worked with illustration software before. Simply add a first spot on our canvas and then you get a line. If you hold Shift, then you get a straight line. So let's do that here. And therefore you can then draw any icon or any illustration element that you would need. Now, if you jump out of this menu, you could still get those points again by double clicking, and you can adjust them. You can also get the Bezier curves. Let's double click to go back into our illustration. If you click on here, you could then get the curves and you can manipulate them further. Scaling in Figma. The scaling tool in Figma gets overlooked quite a bit, but comes in very handy at times. Here I have a vector illustration, and you can see that this is made up out of different shapes, and these shapes have a stroke that has a different weight. So sometimes it's 28 and so on. Now, if I want to enlarge that, what I could do is go to the edge until you see the little arrow key appear, and then hold Shift down to keep the proportions, and now I can change the size. However, with the strokes, it just doesn't work properly. It doesn't give me the right proportions. So a much better way to do this would be to use the scale tool. To activate the scale tool, select any image, and then in the top toolbar, you can see under Move, there is the scale tool, or you can simply use the shortcut K. So let's hit K, and you can see right now it looks like nothing happened, but it's just activated up here. But as soon as you select any element, you can see on the right hand side in the properties panel, the little scale tool appear. And now I could scale this up, so I could either scale it directly on the canvas. So notice how the arrow looks a little bit different. I could also use this one here, so I could say I want this to be 2 times the original size. So we could also scale this down again, 0.5, and notice I can change the scale direction. So I see scale from here, or I can simply add a certain width or height I would want this to have. So a really, really handy tool. By the way, sometimes you get stuck in it, so make sure that you close it. If you feel that you're like trapped and can't find your tools, then it's because you're still in the scale tool. So simply press X and you're back at your standard menu. Let's get to know one of Figma's most important features, components. Once you start designing, you're going to notice that you're going to design the same elements over and over again. So things like my navigation and my cards. And by the way, remember to unclip your parent frame in order to see all the content. Now, instead of redoing those elements and trying to keep up with any changes, it's much more handy to have some sort of template, which in Figma we call a component. And from that component, you can make copies. In Figma, we call that an instance, which you can use across your design. So let's set this up. I'm going to pull out this navigation here because I want to get right away into the habit of having my components separate from my design. In order to turn the navigation into a component, simply select it, and then in the top toolbar, hit the component button. Note how this is going to result in a purple outline and a component sign attached to the name. And you can see the same change in the layers panel. Other ways to create a component would be the shortcut Alt or Option, Command and K, or simply right-click and choose Create Component. Now we want to use an instance, so a copy of this component in our design. There are also several ways we could do that. You can create an instance simply by copy and pasting it, or which is a little faster, hold Alt pressed and then simply pull out a copy, which you can then place inside of your design. Note how the instance also has a purple outline, but it has an empty diamond shape. Other ways to create an instance is to jump to the Assets panel, so this is right next to your Layers panel, and here you'll see any component that you created in that file or later on which you connected with an external library. You can simply pull out that component and then place it onto your design. So let's get rid of our navigation from the articles page and then replace it with our instance as well. Besides the Assets panel, you can also jump to Resources and then simply look for your components via their name. Let's do the same for our card. And this time I want to use a shortcut. If you ever forget about a shortcut, simply hover over the component symbol and then it's going to show you here. So in my case, this is Option, Command and K. Now let's jump to the Assets panel where I can see my card was saved as a component and I can place it into my design. I also want to replace the other card, so let's get rid of it. And by the way, I can also just copy right from an existing instance. If you hold Shift pressed and Alt, then you'll copy right below in the same line. However, it also copies over the content from my component. So what I'll do is I usually have my component quite neutral. So I would get rid of this image here and let's replace it by clicking on plus with just a neutral fill. And then my headline, I'm also just gonna call headline. So I generally try to have all my components quite neutral, and I will then fill in the information, the content in my design. So let's find out how to do that. Let's learn what and how to override in our instances. So here we have a bunch of components and we use instances of those components in our design. You can see this by having a look at the layers panel and you can see the empty diamond shape. If you ever want to see the original component, then in the right hand side, right next to the instance name, you can simply click on the component sign and it will jump to the original component you used to set up this instance. So I usually leave my components quite neutral and descriptive, but in my design I obviously want to add some content. So I want to change those gray backgrounds into images and I want to add a headline. So for my headline, I could just double click and then override this. And I can do the same for my images. I could simply go to fill and then change into image and import them, or I can use my shortcut with this Shift, Command and K, and I'm gonna bulk import those images. And I can now simply drop them into the shapes. I want the cloud here as well, so I'm gonna select that with my shortcut Shift, Command and C, which will copy a PNG, and I can now simply paste it into this shape here. However, there might be some elements that you actually don't want to be overwritten. For example, this back button here, I always want this to be called back. So I can simply select my component and then select the text that I want to stay fixed. And in my layers panel, if I hover over this, I can see this little lock and then lock this layer. So right now in the design, nobody will be able to click and change this text. Now, the great thing with setting up your design with components and instances is that even if you were overriding this, you could still design in your components. So for example, here we might want to change the setting a little bit. We might want to increase the size of this text, and you can see that all instances will follow. Also, some more dramatic layout changes. Let's say we want to move our menu to the left, so all instances would follow. Two small comments. You might be wondering, why is this component here, this back component, set up over the whole width? So why does it span the whole width and has all this space around it? You don't have to do it like this. You could also just take the text and turn that into a component, and that's your button. I quite like it like this. In this way, I already know that this is the distance. I just have to put it right below my navigation, and I don't need to worry about the distance between the image being the same if I create more pages. But feel free to find your own way on how to set this up for your design. The other thing you might be wondering is, what about the text? Doesn't this have to be a component as well? Well, you could set up text, like for example here where it makes sense, where the text is a link, or this might be a intro where you might add more details, maybe icons or something like this. So you might have a set composition and turn this into a component. But just copy text, just standard text on your design like this does not need to be a component at all. So that was it. I hope you found this useful and you feel comfortable in setting up basic designs in Figma. Once you feel good with those essentials, then make sure that you check out the full Figma course on moonlearning.io. Besides the basics that we just covered in the last hour, we're going to jump into more advanced components. So we're going to talk about what to override, when to override, reverting components, nesting components, and of course creating component sets with variants. We're also going to talk about how to move those components and keeping them organized, as well as how to share them with other designers and developers. We're also going to talk about variables and styles. We're going to learn how to create color variables, spacing variables, set up collections, when to use variables versus styles, and in general, how to deal with things like typography, spacing, color, how to document this, how to use them in Figma, share them with others like developers and designers. Then we're going to move on to even more advanced topics such as responsive design. In Figma, we use something called auto layout to set up these components that react to changing content and changing sizes. We're also going to have a look at basic prototyping, so how to connect different screens, how to showcase them in the browser or even on your phone, and how to set up different kinds of animations. And to finish off, we're going to have a look at sharing with other designers and developers in some more depth, creating shared team libraries, as well as documenting everything so it's ready to be shared in Figma's dev mode. Besides the Figma Beginners course, you'll find plenty of other courses on moonlearning.io around the subjects of UX, UI design, and Figma in general. You'll find all links in the description below. If you liked this video, hit the subscribe button, there is more coming. This was a course by moonlearning.io.